Hi, so we're going to learn how to do the rubber molds today. So step one is going to be to preheat everything. And so I'm going to turn on the vulcanizer. You can see that the red lights turn on here. If they don't, double check and make sure it's plugged in. Sometimes that's the culprit. The temperature is already set, and in here we have a little mark indicating what kind of our best temperature is. It's somewhere around like 315 degrees. And then you can also see that both of my platens are down. You really want to make sure that this stays closed so that it can maintain that heat. Also, I'm going to go ahead and turn on my wax injector because most likely I'm going to have other molds that I want to fill up while I'm in waiting time for the vulcanizer to create my mold. So I like to turn this on so that that pot can get nice and hot. Okay, so now we've got to get everything prepped. So now we're ready to make our mold. We're going to create a rubber mold. I am using Castaldo Gold Label Premium Soft Rubber, and we're going to create our mold so that we can have multiples. So first step is to get this piece all the way cleaned up the way that you want. I already have a sprue system built onto it. I've cleaned up both sides. These are the previous castings that I did, and those are also cleaned up and ready for a mold if I want to make multiples of them. So my next step is to get my frame. And what I end up doing most of the time is I go back through the instructions again. So when you look through your rubber mold material, you're going to see this fact sheet and technical bulletin, and then here are the directions. And so for one thing, I do like to double check the temperature. On our vulcanizer, we've been putting a little mark of where our optimum temperature is. And ours is, we want it to be 307 degrees. Ours is probably close to like 315 degrees, just for the nature of opening it and closing it and, you know, elements going out over time. And then the other really important thing is going to be this section where it talks about the mold thickness and the number of pieces of rubber you need and the minutes that you need for your particular mold. So a lot of the times in here, especially with this brooch project, we are going to be using this mold, and we want to measure that first. And so this one is 3/4 of an inch in thickness. So when I look at my material sheet, 3/4 of an inch, it says 6 pieces and 45 minutes. So what I usually end up doing is I add 1 extra piece and I add another 7 minutes to that. So I'll readdress that again, but that extra piece is going to allow it to really flow into the small spaces, especially if I haven't, you know, been that detailed about my cutting out. Okay, so I have my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces, and the first step is going to be to place the piece on here while considering the button. So when you buy the rubber mold material, you can also buy the rod with the rod former, which is here. And so you can see the rod former is there. You can cut that down to whatever size you want. So a lot of times we have it something like this, so that then this piece could either be soldered to your piece or it could just be connected directly to the sprue that exists. So for now, I don't actually need the rod. I need the button though. So my first step is going to be to draw this shape onto my rubber. So that's what I've done here. And just used a Sharpie marker. So just use a Sharpie marker and draw it on. Next step, I need to cut out that space. We're going to be using a scalpel for the rest of the project. You could either use a scalpel for this step, or you can even use some sharp scissors or an X-Acto blade. So remember that if we're using a scalpel, be really conscientious of where your fingers are. So I'm still kind of working that form. Remember, be really careful with your scalpel. I'll change my blade whenever I cut this mold open, but this is a non-surgical scalpel, but obviously it's a scalpel, so it would really cut you. Remember, I'm going to leave the label on anytime I set my scalpel down, set it down to the side with the point away from you. I'm going to leave my labels on, and that's just going to keep this nice and clean so that if I want to use any of those little pieces, I can. It's a good idea to have some scissors next to you just so that you can cut little bitty pieces and you don't have to rely on your scalpel. So next thing that I'm going to do is I'm also going to cut out the button shape in another layer. So my piece was really flat, and so that's why I only really needed one layer of material there. So this will look like this. So I've got one more little button shape to cut out as well. If your piece is super three-dimensional, you're going to have to cut out a couple of those of the shapes of your piece. If only one part of it's three-dimensional, you might just be cutting out a little hole for that super three-dimensional part. So let's go ahead and double check how this looks. So the button would be here. My piece would fit right in here. And then that would fit there. And so that's looking great. Any of these little things, if I really wanted to, I could shove a little piece of rubber in between the legs or in between that triangle just to make sure that it filled great. And maybe I'll go ahead and do that for this demo just so that you can see what it looks like. Okay, so the next step is putting everything together. So this step's really important. You want to make sure that you peel off the layers. Because obviously this all needs to melt together. It will not melt together if it has the protective layers on them. But I do leave it on there because I want this rubber to stay perfectly clean until I'm ready to make the mold. And so you do all your cutting and everything with those labels on. And then I'm going to put it together and just squish. And so you can see there's my first layer. You want the textured side to the gold side. So I take this one off. And then I put this one on. That's going to give it a really good edge to connect to. Try not to get your fingers on the clean rubber because we don't want any grease or any dirt or anything. So I just squish it all together. And then I keep going. So I'm going to put my piece in now. I'll put the button in. I've got a little bitty piece that I cut out that I can put in. I would use, you could use tweezers so that you keep this nice and clean. I'm going to take off this layer. Now some people will have different ways of doing this, so you might at this point have like little markers that you put in for the halfway point. We're gonna cut ours open, and so I don't have any of that. I'm just shedding the whole form in. And sometimes at this stage, I like to just draw a couple of lines at the center point. They don't always stay whenever it melts, but it's at least a good indicator of where to start cutting. So I just drew a couple of little lines there in the center. So there's my centerpiece. My piece is in there. I will say that so there's two common things that happen whenever people make molds. One, they forget to take the labels off, and two, some people forget to put their piece in, which is super embarrassing to get an extra amazing mold of nothing. So really make sure that you get your piece and your button in. So I'm going to go ahead and get the bottom one off. I have two more to put on. And And again, other people are going to have different ways of doing these molds, so I highly suggest working with lots of jewelers, learning kind of the best practices here. For the most part, I follow the directions from the company that sells the rubber, and they're really good. Every once in a while I like to read them again if it's been a while so that I don't forget anything. Okay, so there we have it. Everything's nice and squished together. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces. So my next step, I have these aluminum blanks that are with the mold. I'm going to take the bottom off. I'm going to take the top off. Well, I might go ahead and squish it in there so that I can really push on that top. So now take that off. And then I want to place it about halfway where I've got it, you know, each side sticking out. Now I usually have the top side sticking out just a tiny bit more because the vulcanizer is going to push that down into the center place. So it looks like that. Okay, so I set that down, set this down, and then I'm going to head to my vulcanizer. So our next step, I've made sure that my mold is in there. I have it kind of a little bit more towards the top, but basically centered. I've got both of these aluminum pieces on there. It's a good idea to get the hot gloves ready because this is still hot enough that you could get a little contact burn. So I'm going to open it. Set it in. Make sure that it's centered. Go down. And I'm actually going to flip mine over because looks like I've got the squishy part going the other way. So get it nice and centered. I'm going to stay with it for just a second because it's all getting warm. That extra piece that I put in there is currently working on squishing kind of into the piece and around the platform. So I wait just a little bit. And I'm just tightening it in small increments. Okay, and so we're ready to go. So it's nice and tight. After reading my directions again, I had 6 layers, which suggests 45 minutes. I added an extra layer just so it could really squish a lot of rubber in there, and I'll cut off any of the excess later. And so I'm going to be heating it for, I'm going to add 7 minutes or even 7.5 minutes. So 52 minutes it's gonna stay in here. I'll try to zoom in on what this looks like. And there it is with that rubber kind of squishing out the bottom. That's okay. It's all on those little aluminum sheets. I set my clock for 52 minutes. So my timer's up on the vulcanizer, so I have my welding gloves. I need to open this up. I'm going to take this out. And I'm going to put this all the way back down. Not tightened, but just down. Now I'm going to head to the sink. So here we are at the sink. The instructions will remind you that you can let this cool on its own and that will work, but in a rush or in need to be able to cut that mold apart, you can use water. So I will make sure that I really clean off my aluminum and get it nice and dry afterwards. And everything will be pretty hot. So I'll pull open my mold, make sure that that rubber gets more already pretty good. And so you can see how much this pancaked into that space. And then I pull out my molds. I might get it wet one more time. Remember, it was at 307 degrees, so it's hot. And definitely that button is hot, but it's now it's reduced heat quite a bit. So sometimes I like to pull out the button while I'm here. That just keeps me from burning myself at my desk later. Okay, now I immediately need to go and I need to cut this open because it's a lot easier to do when it's warm. So you're going to need to save yourself roughly 2 hours to work to be able to get a mold done and to cut it open. Okay, so we have the mold. It's still a little warm, so be careful once you start to cut into it. You can see that everything melted really well. Because I can't really see the individual layers anymore. In the instructions you can tell, there's a couple of images of what happens if your mold isn't a good one, and it'll tell you maybe that your heat wasn't high enough or you didn't have it packed well enough. So far this looks pretty good. So the next step is I've got to cut it open, which is kind of the terrifying step. So you need to make sure that you are not doing anything else, you know, and make sure that you're really careful whenever you're working with the scalpel. So the first step is I have to get a new scalpel blade, and this works by this slides off. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with that leftover blade. I have a new blade. Again, these are non-surgical blades, but obviously they will cut the same way that the other ones do, so you've got to be really careful. So I'm holding it from the back of it. It slides into a little groove here, and then you heard it pop. So once it pops into place, we're good to go. I'll show you what I'm going to do with that other blade. So the other blade, I'm going to put it into the paper where it came from, and then I'm going to take some masking tape and I'm going to really wrap up that paper so that I can dispose of this and not hurt anybody that's handling the trash. So just get that really taped up. The other thing you can do is that if you have a lot of them, you could take like a film canister or something that that you might have and put a little slit in it and put all of the leftovers in it and then tape that up and throw away the whole container later. Okay, so new blades in. I left all of this excess because sometimes it's helpful for me to be able to hold on to it. So I'm going to be using this little nail that's in my desk to help me with my mold. You'll be able to see on the like a Rio Grande website or any of the manufacturers, you'll be able to see that they have these little clamps that can also hold the mold, and that would be awesome to have because this is always going to be a little awkward. So I do still have my marks that I made that tell me where my center was. Make sure you're aware of where your body is so that you're not catching the scalpel on the way out. So on the corners, I generally create a key. That's going to be a way that my mold can go back together. So if it gets hot, I can go and quench it with water again, but there you can see my sprue. And I'm just going to start to follow that down. Start from the other side. So you can see there's my sprue. And again, I'm just kind of wedging it. Make sure those fingers are all out of the way. And I'm going to keep working. Once I have a place in between, I like to pull the mold up on one side and then just lay my scalpel flat. Just getting it at that center point. So I still have a little ways to go down on this side. And I already created my key. And I'm going to keep working my form. Now I have really thin little legs on this spot, so I'm slowing down, trying to find the center point, and then cutting into that portion. And you can see all that portion in between is part of the mold. My mold's not too hot anymore, so I'll do the same thing where I'll pull it down, and then I'm going to keep my blade flat, and we'll just kind of work that mold so I can get those legs out. So I'm still working my way down, trying to keep it center point of my pattern. Once I get close to the edge, I want to create my keys so that the mold has something that it can shift on and can lock into place. Got one more center point, cut that out, and then I can pull my pattern out. Okay, so this little guy is done. I could have done a little bit better on the keys on this side, but that will work. So I'll just take this to a cutting mat and I'll cut off the edge. This one will be ready to go. So I have the rubber mold cut. I cut off the edges and finished those up. Again, I would have liked to be a little bit more faceted on my keys, but this should be okay. So You'll notice that at the bottom here, my sprue isn't touching the button. That's because I didn't solder it on. And you don't have to do it this way. You could just go ahead and solder it on from the beginning or put it on one of those little risers. But I often make some adjustments with the mold. It's really important you have good ventilation if you're going to do this. But I just have a solder poker that I've committed to being for rubber. I have my ventilation on, and I'm just burning that sprue. It's a good idea to have some paper towel sitting way away from the fire, so that you can clean up the sprue edge. Again, the ventilation is critical here because we are burning rubber. This is also how you would add a new sprue. Perhaps your mold isn't working whenever you're using the wax injector. So this could be the way that you do that. So I kind of get the initial thing burnt in, and then I'm going to clean it up a hair, and then we'll go see if it worked. You can also use your scalpel to create vents in a mold. And then I like to close it. And obviously don't stick your tool too far in. To get it nice and hot and make sure that that opening is nice and clean. Just making sure that that wax has a really great sprue to just go straight into. Put this in the area that you have for your rubber molds, because you don't want that anywhere near the solder station. And then I'm just going to clean all this off. And then let's head to the wax injector and see if this one is working well. Remember that the first time that we use the wax injector, the first pattern is going to go in the trash. That's going to also get any of this kind of nasty rubber stuff off, but we don't want to recycle that one.